title of this evening's webinar is When Doctors and Their International Medical Associations Are Complicit with State Torture, a discussion of the Israeli Medical Association and other cases. There are more than 120 people registered, and people are coming in as we speak. And I think the numbers really are quite amazing and demonstrate the interest and need for accurate information about what's going on the ground and good analysis during these extremely troubling times. And everyone who signed up should have gotten several relevant articles sent to them, and you should email me if you didn't get those articles. Now, the Health Advisory Council plans to do a webinar every 3 months. Our next one is March 5th with Brad Parker from Defense of Children International Palestine and No Way to Treat a Child campaign. So with these webinars, we have several goals. One of them is to provide up-to-date educational experience on health and human rights issues, with the focus being on Israel-Palestine, and often on topics that we don't usually see in our mainstream media. We also want to link JVP members and their friends with professionals and activists internationally, and provide a forum for Q&A. And we want to stimulate you to become more politically active and hopefully to join the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. And you can do that on the JVP national website. My name is Alice Rothschild, and I'm on the steering committee of the Health Advisory Council. And today we are joined, as I said, by Dr. Derek Summerfield, who's both a personal friend and colleague. Now, the way we're going to do this, for those who haven't done the webinar before, is that Derek and I are the only ones with our mics on. Everyone else is muted, but you will have a chance to ask questions of our speaker, and Tali Ben-Daniel from JVP National is on the call in case we have a technological meltdown, but things are looking good. You will all receive a survey after the webinar, and we look forward to your comments and suggestions, and we really do take these seriously. This is going to be recorded and posted on the JVP National website. So now what I'm going to do is introduce Derek, and then he's going to speak for 30 minutes. And I want you to be writing your questions while he's talking and also during the Q&A in the chat box. And for those of you who haven't done this before, to get on the chat box, you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen and chat box comes up. And then you click on it and it says to everyone, and then you can type questions. And I will be monitoring the questions and trying to curate them and organize them so that Derek has a chance to give everybody a chance, hopefully. And then the Q&A is going to last for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a 5-minute wrap-up. So let's officially start. So Alan Myers, who's also on the Health Advisory Council, and I first met Dr. Derek Summerfield in 2008 on a bus going from Ramallah to the Erez checkpoint to Gaza to protest our inability to get permits to enter Gaza for a mental health conference that was very ironically called Siege and Mental Health, Walls versus Bridges. This was organized by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. And we have since then have all worked together in various ways on the issues of the involvement of doctors in the torture of prisoners. Dr. Summerfield is an honorary senior clinical lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College University of London. He previously was a research associate, Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He's a consultant to Oxfam, principal psychiatrist at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture in London. And he's been doing human rights work and academic collaboration regarding Israel-Palestine since 1992. So Derek, take it away. It's all yours.
Thanks, Alice. Well, good evening all. Well, good morning, since it's 1 o'clock here in London. We talk about the relationship between medicine, ethics, and politics, I suppose. And what I want to think about, using the case example I'll come to, is the idea of a doctor as a doctor and the idea of a doctor as a citizen. It might be said, as a profession, that doctors have been closer to those with money and power than those without. And it's interesting to look at the response of the medical profession when there have been successful revolutions, often much needed revolutions, countries like Chile or Cuba or Mozambique. Most of the doctors left the country and made it clear where their priorities stood. The behavior of doctors in the Second World War, notably Japanese and German physicians, their outrageous behavior led, as some of you will know, to the creation of a body called the World Medical Association, which I'll refer to henceforth as WMA. They are the international official watchdog of medical ethics and medical behavior worldwide, and in particular in relation to doctors and torture. The WMA have a declaration of Tokyo, which forbids quite clearly any involvement by doctors in torture, not just in the sense that they are participating in the room, but that they must, if they encounter torture or think they encounter it, are duty-bound to speak out, attempt to protect the detainee, and to protest. That is a duty laid down by the Declaration of Tokyo of the WMA. And I want to give you an account of our experiences over years, and that certainly includes working with JVP too on an Israeli case, the case of the Israeli Medical Association, and to some extent individual Israeli doctors. Just to say, though, briefly, before we get on to that, some other sorts of cases, a colleague I used to know called Horacio Riquelme looked at doctors' behavior during the military regimes, harsh ones, in Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, and found that whilst doctors obeyed certain kinds of ethical positions like confidentiality and talking nicely to the patients, they accepted the government's version of patients as subversivos or communists and would betray them, and saw that that was a wider duty. In other words, at that moment, their view of a doctor as a loyal citizen trumped their view of a doctor as an ethical doctor. Something, and I'll come back to that later when I talk about the work of Weber, the German social theorist. In Turkey, when I was working at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture some years ago, we did a lot of work with tortured Turkish Kurds who were seeking asylum in Britain. And when we published this in The Lancet, a famous medical journal based in London, there were some wonderful letters from Turkish doctors, loyal Turkish doctors, which were published in The Lancet, which said, and one sentence said, I love this, from a doctor, no state tortures its citizens unless they have to. So that said something about the relationship of the Turkish medical mainstream to police states in Turkey. I wouldn't go on, you will know this better than I, much more recently, the role of American psychologists in the enhanced interrogation program. And as you know, evidence-based case naming the psychologists presented to the ethics committee of the APA have led to the APA refusing to act. They too, it seems to me, are honoring some duty as a loyal citizen ahead of anything else. Maybe one distinction we have to draw here in doctors' behavior is whether it is safe personally for them to do that. There are many parts of the world where ethical behavior by doctors speaking out in the way that they are mandated ostensibly by the World Medical Association would be a sentence of death. In Syria, in 1980, about 105 doctors spoke out about some ethical matter together. They included everyone from junior doctors to professors of medicine in the medical schools. The response of the Syrian regime, this is Assad Elder, was to arrest the whole lot, execute a number of them, and give the rest 30 years in prison, from which only some of them emerged 30 years later. For them, it was a death sentence to speak out. In Saddam Hussein's Iraq, people who were deemed to have attempted to dodge military service were given punitive amputations of ears or nose, especially ears, and were admitted to hospital for that purpose. The medical director of the Saddam hospital, the main hospital in Baghdad, refused to do that, and he was executed. So that's one thing. The case I'm going to present to you of the Israeli Medical Association does not fall into that sort of category. No one was going to come and arrest Israeli doctors and do anything terrible to them. So they are making their own choices with their eyes open, without coercion, we have to say. Right. Now, where are we? Okay, first to say, just briefly, there can be no serious argument that torture has been for many years state policy in Israel. For a long time, it was called moderate physical pressure, the kind of euphemism they used. As long ago as 1996, when I was just getting going in my involvement with this matter, Amnesty International wrote, I've got it here, a very substantial piece called Under Constant Medical Supervision, inverted commas, Torture, Ill Treatment and Health Professionals in Israel and the Occupied Territories. They said under constant medical supervision, in inverted commas, as an ironic comment on the fact that an Israeli spokesperson had responded to complaints about ill treatment in detainees by saying, no, they are under constant medical supervision. And Amnesty was saying, well, what does that say about matters, and this was their executive conclusion. They said, health professionals working with the Israeli General Security Services involved in the interrogation of Palestinian detainees form part of a system in which detainees are tortured, ill-treated, and humiliated in ways which place current prison medical practice in conflict with medical ethics. It is a system which Amnesty believes could not function without the acquiescence of health professionals responsible for the care of detainees. Since when, there have been a host of reports, I have them here, over the years from Israel, the Israeli Physicians for Human Rights, henceforth referred to as PHRI, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, Human Rights Watch, Middle East, and United, a UAT, which is an organization coordinating a whole range of NGOs, Israeli and Palestinian. And I'll just read the executive summary from a few years ago. The UAT coalition has observed and recorded evidence of acts, omissions, and complicity by the agents of the state at all levels, including the army, the intelligence service, the police, the judiciary, and other branches of government. And the UAT coalition is of the opinion that until this culture of impunity is addressed, the situation is unlikely to improve. Clearly, this was functioning as a state policy. There can be no argument about the huge weight of evidence base in relation to torture in Israel. I looked up, Amnesty International reports have been peppered by accounts of torture through all of these years. I've reviewed them. And looking today at their most recent report, just published, they wrote, quote, torture and other ill treatment of detainees, including children, remains pervasive. So that's torture per se. Now, how does that bring us to the role of doctors? The torture is taking place generally during interrogation in security units. Doctors routinely form part of those security units and always do. They may only be a few rooms away for what is going on, and I'll come back to that. I started to write about this in The Lancet, the medical journal, in the 1990s, and in the British Medical Journal. At that time, the president of the IMA, I mean by that the Israeli Medical Association, if you don't mind, I can call it the IMA from now on, if that's all right, was a man called Dr. Yoram Blachar, who I think was a pediatrician. He would write back denying everything, would vilify me in the Lancet as someone with some fanatical anti-Israeli obsession, and we can say repeatedly that the IMA were ethically sound because they were members of the World Medical Association. As I said, the World Medical Association is the world's international watchdog of medical ethics. The mere membership per se was offered as the defense for their ethical probity. Well, that was so far. At that time, I worked a lot with a wonderful psychiatrist called Dr. Ruhama Marton, an Israeli psychiatrist, who was the founder of Physicians for Human Rights Israel. And she at one point drew attention to the fact that there were mentally ill Palestinian detainees, often with psychosis, and that the doctors in the hospital were just describing them as, manipulative, and sending them off for prison centers in the desert. When she publicized this on Israeli radio, instead of investigating these cases, as they should be bound to do as members of the World Medical Association, the IMA are members of the WMA, the Israeli Medical Association charged Dr. Ruhama Marton with slander and forced her, or attempted to force her, to withdraw the allegations. So clearly, over many years, the IMA have made their choice about whether they're operating as doctors or as citizens with some other purpose, and with a version of loyal citizenship. Before I get into the actual story, I just want to say that in the past, when I was working for a human rights organization, I wasn't just involved with the Israeli-Palestine case, I was involved with others, but as many others remarked, there is something qualitatively different about campaigning in Israel-Palestine. In all sorts of ways. An article of mine that was published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the world's foremost general medical journals, some years ago, elicited thousands of hostile emails, both to me and to the editor himself, which included death threats directed either to my daughter or to his daughter, asking for our address, that sort of thing. On the whole, you found that these These attacks, which came from people around the world, for some reason doing propaganda work for a foreign power since they lived abroad, were ad hominem. I'd get emails saying, Summerfield, you old Viagra-ridden bastard, that sort of thing. They, on the whole, never engaged with the evidence at all. They just sought to cast some sort of slur on the speaker. At that time, the Israeli Medical Association president was, as I say, Yoram Blachar. And on the BMJ website, you can see it to this day, it's there forever. It's a formal response. He wrote as follows to a paper that I'd written, which quoted Amnesty International, PHRI, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Rapporteurs. He wrote of me, the lies and filth he spews are reminiscent of some of the worst forms of anti-Semitism ever espoused. Now, I'm only presenting that to suggest there's something different. If I was campaigning about Tibet, or about Sudan or something, this sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, there's something different and highly personalizing and polarizing about campaigning about this particular issue. A prominent professor of surgery here in London, Michael Baum, called me a liar in the BMJ, and they had to go to get lawyers involved before he would withdraw it, that sort of thing. Not engaging with the evidence at all. Right, in 1999, when I was working at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture, we sent a delegation to meet the IMA. I wasn't present, but they met the head of ethics of the IMA, a Professor Eran Dolev. And towards the end of the interview, he remarked to them, he must have felt quite comradely. He said, come on now, what's a couple of broken fingers? This is the head of ethics of the IMA. What's a couple of broken fingers in the interrogation of Palestinian men for the information we could get? Well, when they came back, they told me this, and I published it in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And the IMA wrote and threatened to sue me. That's the first time they threatened to sue me. I then got all the people present to publish a letter in the JRMS, in the same journal, confirming that Dolev had said, what's a couple of broken fingers? And of course, the matter's dropped. They move on. Two seminal reports I'd want to draw your attention, both coming from Physicians for Human Rights Israel, PHRI, and PCATI, which is the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. These are fine people. I think Physicians for Human Rights Israel is an organization I've had a great deal of time for over the years. They'd probably be more effective than any of the Physicians for Human Rights organization anywhere in the world. In 2007, PHRI published a detailed account of 9 Palestinian detainees entitled Ticking Bombs. Again, an ironic reference to the defense often given for torture. What if there's a ticking bomb? And I just want to read to you two sentences which capture it. These were substantial cases of torture. One man was left with a spinal injury. What was clear from their account was Israeli doctors saw prisoners at various points before, during, and after the interrogation. They knew perfectly well what was happening to them. They did not take a proper history because they knew. They prescribed analgesics, and in one case even a chest x-ray, but returned the men to interrogators. They did not protest, they did not speak out, and therefore they were in breach of the Declaration of Tokyo, which, as I say, is the core declaration of the World Medical Association, of which the IMA is a member. Later, the PHRI sent a copy to the then head of ethics, Dr. Avi Noam Reches, in Tel Aviv, and the IMA admitted that he had received it, but he did not act on it. I'll tell you what happened subsequent to that. Around that time, the WMA went out of their way to explicitly insist that doctors have to speak out. They can't just, not be in the room where it happens. And that tolerating these things would be seen as a breach of ethics. Just a reminder. From that time on, there have been hundreds of complaints about torture made to the authorities in Israel, and not a single one has ever been investigated, not one. However, after some pressure from PHRI, and probably I think just as a public relations thing, the Israeli Medical Association said, yes, we will conduct an investigation. You will have amongst the 8 attachments which Samantha has been kind enough to send around to you, the copy of the short 10-line letter dated March 2009, which I sent to you because it is the only so-called investigation the IMA have ever done in relation to this extensive evidence base that their doctors were part of teams which put them in institutional collusion with torture, institutionalized collusion. That's what Amnesty International was talking about. You'll find it amongst the 8. All they said was, we phoned a few doctors, they deny anything. And all we have is, they said, to conclude, there is no shred of evidence except the words of the prisoners. What kind of investigation is it that at the outset discounts the account of those people who have ostensibly been tortured? And these are the ones which were extensively reviewed in the ticking bomb case. So that's very clear where the IMA have stood. They have been consistent in that position to this very day, with their eyes open. No one is threatening them. The other case, the other seminal text that also came out of Physicians for Human Rights Israel and Public Committee Against Torture in Israel was in 2011. And you can find it on the website of PHRI, Doctoring the Evidence, Abandoning the Victim. This again was detailed case studies which showed the same thing as the ticking bombs one, that doctors were closely involved in what happened to detainees during interrogation and torture. They often gave false accounts. They write of the tortures, he fell downstairs. Above all, they completely omitted anything which could be used later in a law court, for example, to bolster the case that a detainee might have that he had been tortured. So the medical record was entirely complete. And as PHRI noted, the presence of doctors in the unit gave a sort of legitimation to the torturers, an authentication to the torturers, a confidence to the torturers. Yeah. But nothing that could be provided as evidence in a legal case. So that was 2011. Just to say, just before that, in 2009, and this is where, in part, JVP come into this, I convened a coalition, a unique coalition, I don't think anything like this has ever been done before, of 725 physicians from 43 countries. There were many also from the US who signed up, not least Alice sitting here and Dr. Alan Mayers, then professor of pediatrics at Boston University. We also had the support when we launched of Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, explicit support. And we sent this with all this evidence to the WMA, the World Medical Association, because our old friend, Professor Yoram Blackjar, who was still then president of the IMA, had become president of the WMA, this long-standing apologist for torture and defender of Israeli status quo in prisons, had become the president of the World Ethical Body. At the time, I thought it was a bit like Donald Rumsfeld becoming president of Amnesty International. So we sent the case to them. We sent them the case and asked them to act. The WMA are mandated to show that their own member associations, including the IMA, obey their mandates, obey their own canons, including the Declaration of Tokyo. What happened was they refused and continued to refuse ever to acknowledge our petition and the evidence. And shortly afterwards, I was personally sued for libel by well-known London libel lawyers by Dr. Blackjar. In other words, the current president of the World Medical Association sued me as convener of a campaign which pointed to the evidence that the World Medical Association were not prepared to look at, that they would not act against Israel. Whereas they would speak out about Iran, Bahrain, to give 2 examples, on just a fraction of evidence, which they should do. That's what they were there for, but they would not. So they started to sue me. The upshot of that was, we said, we stand by our case. Noam Chomsky wrote in and various things like that. Alan Mayers of JVP was one of those who wrote in directly to the lawyer. I gave them all the email, giving extra evidence, which had been gleaned from JVP delegations when they had gone, the delegation when they'd gone to Israel, Palestine, had interviewed people. So even more evidence was added by the individual signatories. And the case they didn't continue with the case. I think they were just testing us out. But, I don't think it's possible to imagine something quite more grotesque that that the president of the World Medical Association, who happened to be also the president of the IMA, should sue someone for libel for pointing out doctors' collusion and torture, for which that very body had been formed after World War II. That was the point of them. That's what they were there for. It was clear then that the WMA would not act and investigate Israel no matter what. We sought to draw in the British Medical Association, who are also members of the WMA. They have been supine from the start. They initially stressed their collegiate relationship with IMA. But when in the end, we prodded them and they asked some questions at the WMA, they were told, and they were satisfied with this answer, that the IMA said, look, this is a private Israeli matter, so stay out. We'll sort it out. What is that? What kind of transcending supervision can such a body give? They would not act. So we were left with this, that the world body would not act. It was hollowed out. It was window dressing, and that remains the case. We moved on, actually, to the UN Special Rapporteur of Torture as well, at a time when, a few years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur of Torture was particularly tasked with attending to medical complicity with torture. We went through several rapporteurs, and they would not respond. It is they would have responded to other kinds of cases. They would not respond. No one wants to put their whole career on the line to take on Israel, it seems to me. Even though he was tasked to take on just this sort of case. At the time, I also had connections with Richard Falk, who was then also special rapporteur on the occupied territories, who was very sympathetic. I met him in London, but didn't feel there was anything he could do. So, where were we? So we relaunched 2 years ago. There was the president of the World Medical Association changed. And now it was a well-known British medical academic called Sir Michael Marmot, M-A-R-M-O-T. You'll see 2 letters I put in the BMJ amongst the 8 there, the last 2 you'll see. And we resubmitted our case with new evidence, updated evidence to him, including the 2011 PHRI report that I've mentioned. And this case, this time we thought we'd see whether we could crowd around him fellow British medics. So it was signed by 71 UK doctors. And this is what happened. Imagine this. We sent in the case. He acknowledged receipt, and that was all. And then a week later, we started to get calls saying, have you looked on the internet? And on the internet published was on the internet site of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which had no connection to this case whatsoever. They had published the letter that Sir Michael Marmot had sent as WMA president 1 week after we'd submitted our case, in which he completely exonerated the IMA, said that previous investigations had always showed them to be innocent. Complete rubbish. They'd never been anyone's. They'd never been any proper investigation, except the travesty that I mentioned to you, and gave a wonderful propaganda coup to them. I mean, the Jerusalem Post had, IMA cleared as ethically, that kind of ethically sound, that kind of thing, within a week. And refused to do anything else. Through the British Medical Association, the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, asked him 3 times. I put all this material to the British Medical Journal. They asked him 3 times for a comment. Would he respond to the charges? And he did not. These people have a kind of sense of impunity. Yeah, they don't feel they need to answer anything. I have to say, I'll just say it's not complete yet. I have taken Sir Michael Marmot to the General Medical Council, which is the body that holds the registration of all doctors in Britain, and we will see whether anything comes of that. But they too are.
Derek, you have 5 more minutes. Just
5 more minutes indeed. That's all I need. We will see where that goes. So where does that bring us? So here we've had a campaign running for 9 years now that initially drew in doctors from 43 countries and which could not be more evidence-based. If this evidence doesn't make a case for collusion of doctors, no evidence would in any case. It could not be possible. What are we to conclude? We're to conclude that the World Medical Association is not fit for purpose. It is hollowed out, certainly in relation to Israel. Perhaps it is better to have had no ethical world body like this because, as I say, the IMA would give us their defense in the Lancet in the 1990s, but we are members of the World Medical Association. In other words, membership per se is what they want, as a fig leaf. That is all. They don't want the organization to function. In other words, I have to report on the basis of 10 years of this, that there does not exist any effective and even-handed international supervision of the ethical behavior of doctors. It does not exist in this world. That is it. Even about the matter of torture, which surely goes to the heart of the public probity of the medical profession. It does not exist. Which brings us back to where we started. The doctor is doctor and the doctor is citizen. The social theorist Weber, the German social theorist who died in 1920, had a fine taxonomy. He talked about two kinds of ethics: the ethics of responsibility and the ethics of conviction. The ethics of responsibility is the kind of ethics that would attach to the kind of medical professionalism, for example. You know that doctors have certain kinds of ways of behaving with their patients, confidentiality, respectful handling, all those sorts of things. You know, a certain set of ethical standards and behavior. That's the ethics of responsibility. The other is the ethics of conviction. The ethics of conviction is when you act in relation to prior other values, values which relate to identity or politics, yeah? A certain kind of citizen. And I have found, sadly, that every time in relation to doctors, the ethics of conviction trumps the ethics of responsibility. There's no question about it. Those Israeli doctors and others around the world who are totally supportive of Israel are prepared to ignore the evidence, to vilify those who point to it, whether they are outsiders like myself, or indeed whether they are an Israeli NGO like PHRI, to vilify us all, because they have a higher idea. Yeah? They have an ethical conviction about Israel which trumps everything else, which seems to me to be, you know, a rather depressing point to end. And just to say, this is where issues of boycott arise. When normal structures don't function, when the normal channels that have been set up, both nationally and internationally, to address matters of this gravity do not function, and for a good reason they do not function, that is when people think, what can we do now? Either we've got to go home and play with our children, turn away, or we've got to do something else. And that's when people start to talk about boycott. Yeah? So at that point, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really a wonderful overview of what you've been doing for so long. So we're going to start the Q&A, and I've got some questions already cooking, and I really encourage everyone to write your questions in the chat box. So the first question is, what has been the role of psychologists in evaluating victims of torture and in the process of the prison system? And also, have there been other physicians who are not PHR Israel physicians in Israel that have launched any kind of protest, or is it just Physicians for Human Rights Israel?
I think Physicians for Human Rights Israel are largely physicians. It's an interesting question. I don't know very much about the role of psychologists in Israel, except for two examples. Some years ago, when I was at the Medical Foundation and quite involved with issues of trauma, you know, the whole discussion about post-traumatic stress disorder and all of that, and a Jewish NGO in London had a conference on trauma in war, and their guest speaker was the chief psychologist of the Israeli Defense Force. And the assumption was he could speak about trauma in a way which said nothing about the fact that the Israeli Defense Force were trauma committing. Yeah? They were committing offenses which certainly created psychological trauma. When I put that out to them and I withdrew from the conference, that's where that sat. But the only other contact I've had with this is that some years ago when I was working for Oxfam, I was in Sarajevo towards the end of the Bosnian War. And the conference included children and trauma. And there was a well-known Israeli child psychologist called Ofra Ayalon, who was speaking in that conference. And she was speaking there because she'd been working in Bosnia. In other words, she was an international child trauma specialist. And I went up to her afterwards, sort of innocently actually, and because she had said in her talk, I'm here because the trauma that children suffer in my country is similar to the trauma of children in Sarajevo. So I went up to her and I said to her, without thinking very much, what's been your experience of treating trauma in Palestinian children? And she said to me, oh, I could never treat a Palestinian child. I would always be thinking, is his father a terrorist? So, this is the kind of moral relativity that clearly is capable of infusing other categories of health professionals, and not just doctors. But I have to say specifically, I don't know what, say, the Israeli Psychological Association have done in all of this, or the psychologists are involved in the security units. Presumably they are not posted to security units the way that doctors routinely are. Physicians for Human Rights, incidentally, say that if the IMA were to withdraw doctors from interrogation units on the grounds that they're going to be in institutional collusion with torture, torture would stop in Israel. It could not carry on. It would lose its cover. Now, that's an extraordinary thing. The IMA know all of this perfectly well, and they have made their choice with eyes open over many decades.
Mm-hmm. So one person wants to know how you got involved in this whole thing and what inspires you.
I don't know. I grew up, I was born in South Africa, and my mother's an Afrikaner, and they were all total supporters of white supremacist rule there. But I grew up mostly in Zimbabwe, and there was a place where one could see how, certain kinds of human beings were considered more first class than other kinds of human beings. You can imagine, in a colonial situation. So I think that probably primed me a bit. So when I came over to Britain and did medicine here, I saw similarities between the South African situation, the apartheid situation, and what was happening in Israel. As you know, Jimmy Carter wrote a book about apartheid in Israel, which got him in a lot of trouble. Let me tell you something. The South African apartheid system was harsh, but it was noddy in toyland compared to what has happened in Israel. If only the kill rates. One of the members of the ANC in those days, who was underground then, is actually was a white Jewish guy, whose name escapes me at the moment. But I was in a conference with him some years ago in Barcelona, and he said to me, "Look, South African government was bad, but I don't remember them using rockets launched from helicopters into a block of flats to kill one guy on in flat 4 on the 3rd floor." So, what one can say? I think Israel is an apartheid situation, as those echoes struck me from the beginning, and I suppose drew me in. But also, I was working for a human rights organization in general, not just from the Middle East. So it became an extension of my work. I left there some years ago, and I've continued it, I guess. I think it is, for me, one of the seminal questions of the world. Robert Fisk, the journalist, describes the Palestinians as the world's most multiply betrayed people. And no one betrayed them more than the British government for over 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. Mm-hmm. And that deepest shame, I think Britain should, as a state, should get the Nobel Prize for hypocrisy. I don't know, that's about it, I suppose.
So another person wants to know, why is the World Medical Association complicit? Like, who are the members that would also side with Israel versus siding with ethics? I mean, what's in it for them?
Yes. Well, I think, and I get my information partly from Physicians for Human Rights Israel, that the IMA have put a lot of work over the years into making themselves useful and prominent at the WMA. I think lots of work, ordinary work to do with how the WMA functions. And a lot of work in making sure that at their annual general meetings, when all the trustees come from around the world, that the question of Israel-Palestine does not come up. And indeed, Hadas Ziv of PHRI told me once that the IMA would come back from their international conferences with the WMA, crowing that how well they'd done at making sure that there were no questions about Palestine arise. They have a series of representatives of the IMA have been prominent in the trustees and the council, and indeed the presidency. The current president of the World Medical Association is the Israeli Medical Association president again, right now, as it was for Blachar, with Blachar, as I was saying 8-9 years ago. The lawyer to the IMA, Leah Wapner, is honorary lawyer to the WMA. So I think that it's not possible to peel the WMA away from the IMA, and they are not going to act. How they have managed to neutralize the professional secretariat within it is another matter I do not know. I think it's it's hollowed out, but it were better that it didn't exist.
Mm-hmm. So
I've taken a professional attitude to managing the WMA over many years.
So do you see the IMA or the World Medical Organization as basically an Israeli Hasbara organization? Are they afraid of being called anti-Semitic?
Well, they clearly, they are not going to act against Israel no matter what. They've reached a position like over many years now. After all, our evidence-based case, which included, as you know, your signature, Alice, is 2009. Over many years, they've made sure the WMA will not act. Indeed, when we submitted that, Alice, that evidence-based case with the 725 physicians, we asked the Secretariat. Obviously, it was a protest against the appointment of Blachar and a request for them to investigate whether the IMA were in fact continuing to fulfill WMA mandates in relation to torture, which of course they were not. God, I forgot my point now. What was it? What were we talking about there?
So I said, is it a Hasbara organization? Are they afraid of being called anti-Semites?
Yes. No, that's right. And we asked the Secretariat to send to all the council members around the world. They only come together once a year, generally. So there are prominent physicians in many countries who are on the council of the WMA, and from time to time, one of them becomes the president. We asked them to send our evidence-based submission to all the council members around the world. We found out a couple of years later they did not. They refused. They kept it and managed it and sat on it in headquarters in Geneva, squashed it, and behaved deeply unethically. This is the world's medical ethical body behaving as unethically as anyone could possibly do. What do you want to do with that?
Okay. There's a question about other countries. Are there other countries where physicians collude in the torture of prisoners and also support Israel? What's the scene internationally?
Yes, there are. Much less evidence is known. I have no doubt that is true. In a funny sort of way, of course, the bulk of evidence on Israel is available to us because Israel is relatively open in some respects compared to, say, looking at the position of physicians in Turkey or whatever. I've no doubt that cases could be built in many other countries, indeed, including the US and indeed the UK. In the UK, only one doctor has ever been struck off, in other words, brought to account for collusion with torture, and this is one which couldn't be avoided. It was the early in the invasion in 2003, British soldiers arrested after there'd been an explosion that killed a few soldiers. They'd arrested this man. You see a picture of this portly Arab man who was a hotel receptionist. And you see him before this happened, standing with his wife and two children. They arrested him, and basically he was tortured to death. And there were about 60 injuries on him. A doctor attached to that brigade of the army wrote out a death certificate which omitted almost all of those injuries. But because of the nature of the case, it came to light, and of course, his role couldn't be overlooked, and he was struck off the register. But that wasn't because, if you like, things naturally tended that way, merely because this case became such a cause célèbre that every aspect was examined. I would say that another British doctor who was serving in the army refused to go to Iraq on the grounds it was unethical because this was an illegal war. It wasn't sanctioned by the UN. He was not supported by the British Medical Association or anyone else. He was sent to prison, as a matter of fact, for taking an ethical stand. So I think one could say for many medical associations around the world, the question remains, who do they address? I mean, this question of the double duty. They have duty as doctors to ethical positions that have been agreed, and their duty as citizens. It's funny enough, Alan Mays of JVP pointed out, I think it was him, Alice, a few years ago, that the way the Declaration of Tokyo, the WMA anti-torture declaration, was worded on the IMA website was altered in some ways. In some key respects, it had been altered, which with wording which appeared to suggest that actually the doctor did have a higher duty to the state than he did to the patient sitting in front of him. And that would be entirely consistent with what has happened. But I'm sure there are many other cases. No case against the medical association or individual doctors has ever been or could ever be more documented than this case. If this work, no case will ever work. And it hasn't worked.
Thank you. So there's an interesting comment. I'm just going to read the comment. I am an Israeli human rights lawyer and was in the legal team of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. I agree that doctors are complicit in torture and ill treatment by the Israeli Security Service and enjoy impunity. I have no interest in to defend Israel, of which I am a fierce critic throughout my career. I do have to bring up some more recent evidence that complicates the picture a little bit. The next chairperson of the IMA, Leonid Edelman, led the IMA to object and protest the forced feeding law that the government passed in 2015 Palestinian prisoners, and the IMA petitioned to the Israeli Supreme Court against the law and were very active against it. There are a few courageous Israeli individual physicians and psychologists who are active against torture, either in the Committee Against Torture or with Psychoactive in cooperation with international organizations. The IMA, headed by Edelman, condemned the forced feeding law as a possible form of torture. They did remain silent throughout the interrogations.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that intervention. I know a bit about that. There's no doubt Israel have been on the right side, and the IMA have been on the right side in relation to force feeding. One could be cynical and say, that they're not unaware of the public relations aspects of something like this, but it is neither here nor there. We are talking about torture during interrogations. Yes, I'm glad that they are against force feeding, but I'm afraid it's another matter. The question of torture, which is happening every day, is a huge, much huger question. If only a few Palestinians are on hunger strike at any one time or whatever, I completely support them on that, but it is beside the point. However, everything I'm very interested to read, because I'm reading it as well. Everything, I'm interested to read what the man whoever it was who wrote in like that.
Smada.
Thank you. Yeah, Smada.
So there's also a long comment. The ethics of responsibility is sustained partly by enforcement of some order, partly by a code of ethics mutually understood by professionals, but also by peer pressure due to the wish to be included among others. But this latter basis might be stronger in those operating and defending their behaviors on the basis of an ethics of conviction. This pressure reinforces and works in tandem or dialectic with the protective function of any guild. In the US, we've observed the American Psychological Association struggling through a period of tremendous scandal due to its collusion with the US Department of Defense and Guantanamo. An intention to protect the reputation and professional standing and income of APA members appears, according to an independent investigative report commissioned by the APA, to have been a key aspect of the denial and deceit active in the collusion. Can you comment on how much of these dynamics appear to play out in Israel and Palestine?
Interesting remark. Well, if you're asking whether part of the basis of IMF policy, which has been entirely consistent on this matter for many years, nothing changeable about them, whether any of that relates to an intention to protect reputation, professional standing, and income, I don't know. I would be inclined to think no. I think in many respects, the information we gather is the IMA, or certainly according to PHRI, the IMA have set themselves out as being a kind of shield, a defensive shield for Israeli state policy, to try and give a human face to the occupation. These are words that come from PHRI, and I think that's the primary thing. I think it's political. They have a political stand, which is this is what they should do as loyal citizens, and they have gone entirely consistently to do it. I don't think that matters of professional standing or reputation and income are relevant.
What about peer pressure?
And peer pressure. Peer pressure. Which kind of peers? Which kind of peers do we mean?
Well, co-torturing collusion doctors. You're pressured to be part of the team. You're in a security.
Oh, I see. That may well be so. I mean, the question we ask is, what kind of ethical leadership has the IMA given individual Israeli doctors over many years? They posted to these centers, and this is what happens. I'm going to add that in the 2011 PHR report, abandoning the patient, the one abandoning, they actually gave the name of individual doctors. The information was detailed enough. Those doctors, to my knowledge, have never come forward and said, that wasn't me. They are given impunity by their cover because the IMA gives them the impunity. They know that. And so I do not know whether any individual doctors have become ashamed of what they've done and come forward. The only case I've ever heard of was given to me once by Ruhama Maton, who told me years ago when I met her in Gaza that an Israeli physician friend of hers had come to her privately and said to her shamefacedly that he had been attending to a severely injured, presumably shot, a Palestinian detainee, and had been persuaded by the interrogators to go to the patient and say, I'm going to discontinue the treatment unless you give the interrogators what you want. Now that, of course, is a case where the doctor was directly intervening in, if you like, the torture scene. What we are mostly presenting here is institutionalized collusion, whereby doctors are part of a team which routinely produces torture. They know it very well, and they're not functioning as ordinary doctors. They don't take a proper history because they know how the injuries came. They return them to torturers, and they could not be in more ethical breach if they tried, but they are not in the room where it happens. Yeah? Unlike the APA case, the enhanced interrogation, where psychologists were directly involved in interrogation of some post 9/11 suspects, and were actually, I understand, presumably by headpieces, were giving information or giving tips to the interrogators in mid-course as to what to do. That's absolutely unbelievable. Institutionalized collusion is obviously much more widespread and overall, hugely more corrosive because of the scale of things. Mm-hmm. But apart from that one case that Ruhama told, I have not heard PHR present cases in which an Israeli doctor was in the room when it was happening.
So we just have a little bit of time. Could you comment, is it the same true for female prisoners and for minors under the age of 18? Are the dynamics the same? And just a short comment.
Yeah, well, obviously the vast proportion of detainees are males, etc. At any one time, there are between 150 and 300 Palestinian children in detention, often denied access to lawyers or their parents. There certainly are DCI Palestine, Defense of the Child International Palestine. You can look up on their website. Certainly have documented evidence of ill treatment of children, being beaten up by soldiers or in detention centers, etc. Acts that amount to UN definition of torture.
Stress positions, sleeplessness, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know about women, really. I haven't read any specific separate accounts about women detainees. I do not know what the difference would be, actually. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything, Agnes, on that?
No.
No.
I don't.
We could ask PHRI. Mm-hmm. But there are, Amnesty International, in the report, the most current assessment I said that I read today, referred to children being included in the category of people suffering torture and ill treatment, their words, which is a grotesque thing to think about.
Right. So unfortunately, it's time to do a few closing comments, and I just want to thank you for a very, very excellent presentation. And for folks who are interested in what happens to children in prisons, that's the topic of our next webinar in March. So I just want to thank you, and also just let people know more about the Health Advisory Council if you're not already involved. We have an active web page on the JVP National site. We update it often, and I wish you to check it out. We have a monthly media watch where we submit a curated collection of articles and reports on health and human rights issues in Israel-Palestine. And we have our weekly Human Rights Hero and Violation that comes out hopefully every Monday. That's not just documenting the horrors of occupation, but also resilience and resistance of Palestinians. And then all of us in the council do various kinds of advocacy, journal writing, publications. We helped spearhead the petition for the US-UK Palestine Mental Health Network, urging not to have the national conference in 2019 in Tel Aviv, which was a really powerful experience. We created a big stir, although it's still happening. So we really hope people will go to the JVP website and sign up to be part of the council. If you want to join more actively and work on the Media Watch or the Human Rights Violation and Hero every week, please email me. My email is on the Media Watch page. And also, if you have more passions, interests, ideas, fill out the survey and we will pay attention to those ideas. So I think that's the end of my comments. We actually have a few more minutes. Do you have anything else? Do you want to close a few more things?
Well, really, just to convey my admiration for the work the JVP, the Health Advisory Council, have done over these years, and clearly our paths have crossed on these matters. We've signed up to the same sort of things. I mean, you have no clash between your ethics of responsibility and your ethics of conviction. They're running along together, and you are also showing a particular example of how the physician or health professional can be. Noam Chomsky enjoins us to be moral agents. Yeah. So I thank you for that.
So if people want to work more on this issue, what would you recommend that they do besides support boycott? I mean, but particularly focus on this issue.
They could email me if they want to be on a circulation list. Of course, all the stuff from you, Alice, JVP, I circulate here in Europe and in Europe, in Britain and also in Europe and elsewhere. I'd be happy to hear from people and to put them on our circulation list. It's largely about, it's not just a general, it's largely about including torture in Israel, Palestine, but it also includes things going on in Gaza, the epidemic of maiming that's been going on there, the shooting high velocity military bullets into the knees of youngsters, the killing of paramedics, the shooting of ambulances and all that sort of thing we broadly include, but I restrict things largely to health matters, torture and hospital-like, so it's, you're not going to be bombarded with a lot of other stuff. I keep it fairly tight because there's so much other.
Can you tell me your email?
Derek.sumfield@gmail.com.
Okay.
But I'll email you tomorrow, Alice.
I sent it out to everybody. So.
Wow. That's technology.
So 4 more minutes of closing comments. One of the things I'm very curious about is how Palestinians are dehumanized by the state such that people feel the impunity of being able to torture them. I mean, there has to be some thing that goes on in the culture, in the society, in the messaging that makes Palestinians be less human in the eyes of the torturers and the doctors. Do you have any 3-minute comments on that?
Even your ex-president Clinton, he said of Netanyahu something like, "Oh, Bibi's quite a nice guy, but the one problem is he doesn't seem to think that Palestinians are humans." Even Clinton said that. It's the language that is used. It's interesting. Over the years, various Israeli politicians in the past, Golda Meir included, have used words like cockroaches. They use that sort of language. That language is a preamble to atrocity. Once you start thinking like that, anything is possible. And clearly, the youth are inducted into the army and, in a sense, are sent to shoot unarmed demonstrators who are several hundred yards away from the Gaza fence, including well-marked paramedics and journalists. And we know there's been some protest about that. I mean, some of the most courageous people in Israel have been, I remember there's a woman whose daughter was killed in a suicide bombing in a disco. Remarkable people, remarkable. Now, she's been on a journey,
Is that Nurit Peled or no? Nurit Peled? No.
No, it wasn't her. No, it wasn't her, actually. And those people have spoken out of the depths of their own loss about what does it mean for the new generations in Israel to grow up being taught to hate and to shoot Palestinians? What is this? Where is this going? But obviously, political developments in Israel don't give us much cause for optimism at the moment. I think that Israel is a young society. It's a frontier society. Frontier society is not very old. Frontier societies have shallow roots. If you like, they're adolescent societies. And like an adolescent, there seems to be no limit. An adolescent may do something, it's antisocial. And if there's no comeback, if there's no cost, well, they push on a bit more. There's no, I believe 20 years ago, the Israeli Defense Force would say, well, if we can shoot 2 or 3 Palestinians a day if necessary and no one really notices. Well, that kind of fastidiousness is not around anymore. Mm-hmm. They can commit massive war crimes, can shoot hospitals and ambulances, kill patients in their beds, and the world's bodies say nothing. I mean, Britain, this country, this miserable state, did not utter a word of criticism about the slaughter that's been going on in Gaza, you know, in the last few months. Not a word, not a word. So Israel gets no checks on its behavior, and like adolescent pushes on and pushes on. I don't know what they'll push on to. You know, I don't know what would limit them.
Right.
I fear.
Well, I think it's people like us that have to limit them, and that's a big, 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 big challenge. So we finished our hour. Thank you again so much. This has been really good. And I also want to congratulate you on entering the 21st century and understanding how webinars work, because it was a bit of a journey to get you here, and I'm very proud that you did it. So
Indeed.
Thank you, everybody. I think
Thank
this was a wonderful evening, and please fill out your surveys, because we read them all, and we want to know what people are thinking and what they're looking for. Thank you so much.
Fine. God bless you all, eh? Thank you. Thank you, Alice. I'll email you tomorrow. So what happens now then?